You are now watching The Meech.
I've been a Nintendo fan for well over a decade. I've covered many games and have seen a lot. I was there for the dark era with games such as Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival and Chibi Robo Ziplash. I was there for the Pokemon National Dex fiasco, and I've been watching out for Baron Mario sports games ever since Mario Tennis Aces. But never did I ever picture us being where we are now, because the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet situation is one I never could have imagined, even in my worst nightmares. Technically, Pokemon isn't directly developed by Nintendo, but can you play Pokemon on Xbox? That's what I thought. Pokemon and Nintendo are so closely integrated that the specifics aren't the issue. If you want to argue about definitions, the Bluebird Circus is that way. But even so, Pokemon is the biggest media franchise in the world, grossing over $100 billion. They have the resources to literally make a cinematic masterpiece of a game, and what we're left with is this. I've been a Pokemon fan for over a decade. Pokemon Soul Silver on the DS remains one of my favorite games to this day, and many agree with that sentiment. The DS Pokemon games are excellent, Pokemon Black and White 2 being seen as some of the best games in the series, and this is where many say Pokemon peaked. There's no denying Pokemon has gone downhill, but the question is, when exactly did the series decline? Some would say almost a decade ago with Pokemon X and Y, which is when the series made the jump to 3D. But I didn't see it that way. Pokemon X and Y introduced a ton of new features, with many being major additions. The Fairy type was introduced, and the Mega Evolutions were incredible. Seeing classic Pokemon get these awesome new designs was really cool. I don't understand why they decided to ditch Mega Evolutions in succeeding games, because it's a concept that's proven to still have a lot of potential. The only issues I had with X and Y were the lack of a post-game and the lore of Kalos not really having much depth. Gen 6 really needed that fabled Pokemon Z to sorta act like a Pokemon Emerald or a Pokemon Platinum for Gen 6, so that likely means that Gen 7 is when Pokemon declined, right? Hate to break it to you, but I found Pokemon Sun and Moon to be far better than X and Y. It might not have Mega Evolutions, but it refined the Pokemon formula excellently, and we did get some new forms with the Alolan Pokemon. It also introduced some major quality of life improvements, removing the archaic HMs and having the fresh concept of island trials rather than gyms. Sure, there were a lot of cutscenes, and the games were a bit easy, but you could turn off experience share if you wanted a more challenging experience, and Alola is an excellent region at that. So that has to mean Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee were the decline. As crazy as it is to say this, I actually like Pokemon Let's Go. It might not be a traditional Pokemon experience, but it's a good remake of Pokemon Yellow with many quality of life improvements and a surprisingly good presentation. And I will say, the Pokeball Plus is such a fun controller to use. But if that's not the case, it has to be Sword and Shield. It just has to be. Why yes, it would be. Because Pokemon Sword and Shield are absolute trubbish. Let's ignore the coup font in the room with the National Dex, because even though it was bad not to include it, the issues with Pokemon Sword and Shield go way beyond that. Having forced experience share makes the game so easy to the point where it's not even fun to play. I was able to take out pretty much all the gym leaders with primarily just a Clefairy. And that's not even getting to the major removal of features. Things like the GTS were omitted for an archaic trading system, where you need to trade with friends if you're looking for a specific Pokemon, and they couldn't even get that right. A friend of mine wanted a Ponyta, and it took nearly an hour for us to be able to trade, because the link trade system is absolute garbage. But the worst thing about Sword and Shield is that all you're left with after the major sacrifices like the GTS and National Dex is a mediocre, play-it-safe Pokemon game. It plays virtually identically to the 3DS games, and it doesn't bother to introduce anything remotely interesting. Dynamaxing is a highlighted new feature, and it's essentially just Pokemon grow big! When the defining gimmick of a game is growing big, it's probably best to avoid it. Considering how by the books and lazy Sword and Shield were, I didn't have high hopes for Gen 9. Considering the visual presentation resembled a GameCube game at best, I assumed Pokemon Scarlet and Violet would be more rushed, lifeless nothingness like Sword and Shield were, and even though Pokemon Legends Arceus was seen as generally good, I assumed Scarlet and Violet would be more similar to the recent games like Pokemon Sword and Shield. Initially, I wasn't planning on getting it, but considering the insane state it launched in, it wasn't a matter of if I should review it, it was a matter of when. As with any game, I go in with an open mind, and I'll be more than happy to be proven wrong. So the question is, are Pokemon Scarlet and Violet truly as buggy as Johto National Park, and as batty bad as everyone is saying they are? Or has everything been blown out of proportion? Our story begins as usual with your trainer starting off in a home, and then venturing off on an ultimate quest to catch Pokemon and become the very best like no one ever was. But Scarlet and Violet actually managed to go beyond that. Once you leave the academy, you can decide on 3 different quests to start with. There's a traditional Victory Road quest, where you get gym badges and aim to be the champion. But if you're feeling a bit more modest, you can help out fellow trainer Arvin to find some mystical herbs. Or you could take down the delinquent group Team Star in the cleverly titled Operation Starfall. All 3 quests need to be completed, but the order you complete them in is up to you. Now, considering this is an RPG, story is a major aspect of the experience. Summarizing it could spoil it, so I'll only be sharing my thoughts to avoid spoilers. I gotta be honest, I don't usually play Pokemon for the story. What even was the story in Sword and Shield? Oh, some kids looking for wishing stars, wishing tree, where I come to think and dream, Pokemon grow big. I didn't care. But Scarlet and Violet actually managed to have some shockingly good and deep storytelling that honestly at times is emotionally impactful, and the story itself is quite memorable. Like I said, I don't play Pokemon for story, but if it's something that stood out to me, that means it had to impress me in some way or another. Out of all the mainline Pokemon games, this game may as well have what is perhaps the best and most in-depth story. Characters are also an aspect where Scarlet and Violet shine bright like a shining pearl. Actually, never mind, because that would imply they're bad. Shine bright like ultraviolet light. There we go. Your rival character Nemona is always eager to battle, and sometimes it can be a bit excessive, but she's a likable and fun character that's a pretty good rival. I gotta be honest, I found Hal's crippling Malasada obsession to be hilarious, and I prefer the more edgy, rude rivals from the older games, but Nemona is a great character that I could easily see becoming a fan favorite. Some of the students you interact with are also memorable, and I found many of the trainers to have interesting personalities and designs that fit them, but by far my favorite character has to be Arvin. They really nailed it here, and I was very surprised that the story was actually a major highlight of the game for me. But as with any game, a good story is nice to have, but the gameplay is going to be the most important factor. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet go for an open world structure as opposed to the traditional linear structure we've seen in most of the mainline Pokemon games. Considering Legends Arceus showcased just how much potential an open world could have, it definitely seemed promising. And this is something the series really needed to do, because despite the series being about evolution, the series is sorta held in Everstone. Gen 5 and Gen 7 were quite refreshing, but they still maintain the core structure of the games. Though to be fair, open world was likely not an option on the DS and 3DS. This could very well be the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild or Super Mario Odyssey Pokemon is needed, so let's see how they pulled it off. Pokemon regions have usually been structured in a similar way. There are towns you'll visit where you'll complete most of the objectives, but there are routes where you catch Pokemon. It's pretty much a linear path, and while there is some exploration, it's mostly just point A to point B. And while that structure of towns and Pokemon habitats are retained, they're connected seamlessly. There's a lot more exploration involved, thanks to the larger environments in scope, and you can defeat gyms and star bases as well as Titan Pokemon in any order. Random encounters are also completely removed in favor of overworld Pokemon. All of this sounds great, but the execution is going to be the real test. With the open world structure, you'll be traversing through locations such as big fields and mountains. Considering how large Paldea is, just having your trainer isn't going to be enough. That's where the game's legendaries come into play. I played Pokemon Scarlet, so the legendary here is Koraidon. Unlike most legendaries, Koraidon is actually a major part of the game throughout the majority of it, not just towards the end. And what this allowed for is the legendaries being able to have a story unfold while you're playing the game, as well as having some personality for them. Miraidon seems to be the favorite, but I can't help but love Koraidon. He feels like your pet dragon, especially during the Titan Pokemon sections, but the main reason why the legendaries are integral to the game is because they are rideable. They can make movement much faster, and they can even jump and climb mountains, but for most of the abilities, you'll need to unlock them by defeating Titan Pokemon. These abilities make navigation far better, and to be honest, I wish they were all available by default. Considering this is an open world game, exploration would be far more fun with all the abilities available from the start, and while you can access every location without the abilities through the caves, it's much more tedious to do. But unfortunately, that's the least of our worries, because Pokemon Scarlet and Violet have some of the sloppiest and unpolished game design I have ever seen in my life. And I have played Pac-Man on the Atari 2600. Let's address the Doniphan in the room. The performance. You've probably seen videos showcasing numerous glitches and bugs. It's unlikely you'll experience glitches where your trainer will Gigantamax or have their eyes pop out, but I can assure you one thing. You're not going to have a smooth experience. The game tries to go for 30 frames per second, but it's rarely ever consistent. Considering how much land there is to navigate through, you'll want to use the legendary for faster movement, but oftentimes, the game will start lagging and essentially be in slow motion. The game performs the absolute worst when you pan the camera out to get a greater view or are in towns. But there is an aspect about the presentation that remains consistent. It's consistently awful. There are many moments throughout the game that stood out as unbelievable. During the beginning when you're in a classroom, the students saying, "Good morning, Mr. Jacques," can reach frame rates in the single digits. There's also a gym challenge where you'll need to find 10 Sunfloras, and the more you find, the worse the frame rate becomes. But these are far from the only examples, because the overall game runs atrociously. I'm honestly shocked that this game was approved, because this isn't a slight ounce of jank. The whole game is essentially jank. Considering I've been mostly positive about the game, you may wonder if I was able to forgive the performance issues during my playthrough. While I was able to beat the game, it was getting increasingly frustrating dealing with the issues. I don't think I ever got to the point of rage quitting, but I did have to ask myself a few times, why am I playing this? There had to have been something I found engaging, but these performance issues absolutely cannot be ignored, and they absolutely were a detriment to my experience. But surprisingly, there seems to be an actual game in this PowerPoint presentation. In true Pokemon fashion, there are gyms you have to complete. This is where you'll fight a trainer who specializes in a certain Pokemon type. In prior games, you'd ideally want to level up your Pokemon before tackling the gyms, and the gyms also had puzzles that you'd need to complete before reaching the leader. But in Scarlet and Violet, you'll need to complete a minigame before reaching the leader. Conceptually, it sounds good, but the minigames are nothing more than boring filler, and I'd go as far to say that they're downright insulting. They are so easy to the point where it's nearly impossible to lose them. I get that these games are made for kids, but that doesn't excuse it. Pokemon has never been ridiculously difficult, but there was an element of challenge. Couldn't beat a gym? Well, that's too bad. Come back where you know what type advantages are, or at a higher level. And the mini-games here aren't particularly fun either. One is essentially DDR, but it's near impossible to lose. And of course it's at a snail's pace. Then there are the Operation Starfall missions where you'll need to take out 30 Pokemon using the new Let's Go mechanic. What you can do is send out a Pokemon to battle in real time without engaging directly in a battle. Surprisingly, I found this to be a good addition considering the open nature of the game, but this is only the case because the act of catching Pokemon is identical to how it's always been. You'll need to encounter them, ideally weaken them, and then you catch them. For a standard Pokemon game, that's fine, but considering how many different Pokemon appear, it's going to be very time consuming. The issue is that Scarlet and Violet didn't retain the catching mechanic from Legends Arceus, where all you needed to do is just throw a Pokeball to catch them, which is ideal in an open world setting, but the Let's Go mechanic is unfortunately the only alternative. I was initially worried it could make the game too easy, but it really doesn't, because the overall game is just way too easy. Going back to the Operation Starfall challenges, you'll have a whopping 10 minutes to defeat 30 Pokemon using the Let's Go mechanic. None of them took me more than 2 minutes at the absolute most, so they're similar to the gym minigames where they're near impossible to lose. The two aspects are so easy to the point where they're insulting, but to be honest, most of the game is pretty easy. None of the gyms were a hassle, and defeating Team Star Leaders was also pretty easy. The Titan Pokemon quests with Arven were easily my favorite, but even then, they weren't very challenging. The overall game is way too easy, but the thing is, it didn't have to be this way, because Scarlet and Violet unfortunately retain the dreaded forced experience share. I can understand designing the core game to be easy, but I will never understand forcing players to play a specific way. And it wasn't always like this. Pokemon X and Y introduced a team experience share, and I found it to make the experience way too easy, so I turned it off for the succeeding 3DS games. But not even having the option is a major problem. Not only does the experience share make Pokemon way too easy, but it completely goes against the entire idea of Pokemon. The purpose is catching these monsters and training them. When you're training them, sure, there's going to be a little bit of grinding, but by doing that, it's rewarding, and you also get a connection with your Pokemon, but when the experience is just shared across the party, it just completely misses the point. It's a major factor why I despise Pokemon Sword and Shield, but to be fair, Sword and Shield have next to nothing going for them, because despite the abysmal performance and the lack of challenge, there's still some good aspects. Part of what makes Pokemon so much fun to play is catching and seeing all the Pokemon, especially the new ones, and the good news is that Scarlet and Violet have some excellent new Pokemon. The starters are some of the best in the series, even if their evolutionary lines are a bit questionable outside of Fuecoco. Gimmighoul is also a really weird, but clever addition, and oh my gosh, Petey is in the game! But my favorite is easily Houndstone. He perfectly captures Halloween, and I absolutely love it. But after going through the Pokédex, I realized something. Gen 9 is a complete mixed bag. There are some Pokemon that look really good, but a lot of them either look super generic or like nothing at all. Like seriously, what even is this? But the thing is that there are many different Pokemon to find from many different generations. There are about 400 in total, which may seem like a lot, but it's less than half of the national dex, so very likely you'll be missing a certain Pokemon. For a game like this, I think it would have been nice to have at least 600 Pokemon, because I often see many of the same Pokemon repeated throughout the game. Unfortunately, the national dex isn't present, which is disappointing, but I expected it. But with all things considered, the act of collecting Pokemon still remains fun. Battling Pokemon also remains fun. It's the same complex rock-paper-scissors system present in all the games, so memorizing type strengths and weaknesses is important. That is until you realize that the game will often tell you what moves are super effective and not very effective. Again, making the game too easy. But there's also the new mechanic of terastallizing. This is Gen 9's defining gimmick. The Pokemon become crystal and can even get different typing, which means you can have a Pokemon like a water-type Pikachu. It adds some strategy to how you set up your team, but I mostly just found it to be a quite literal, flashy gimmick. It is better than Dynamaxing, I'll give it that, but that's such a low bar to cross and it isn't worth being praised. Why they didn't continue with Mega Evolutions, I'll never understand, because none of the succeeding gimmicks even come close to being as cool, and it's something that very easily could have been expanded on with following generations. But it is what it is. Terastallizing is the very definition of a gimmick, and it's going to be ditched in the next generation. Another aspect of the game is being able to craft TMs. It's a cool feature, but one I didn't particularly use. You will find countless TMs just by exploring, and I always had the moves that I needed. By far the best aspect of Scarlet and Violet is the exploration. Exploring Paldea is an absolute blast. Finding new areas as well as Pokemon is incredibly satisfying, and I have to say, I'd love for succeeding Pokemon games to continue going the open world route. Even in a game as buggy and as unpolished as this, it proves to be a good concept. That is when it actually runs. Then there are the online features. You have your typical trading and battling, and right off the bat, trading is far more simple than it was in Sword and Shield. It's quick and easy to set up a link trade, but no matter what, the lack of a GTS is a major problem, and it's unbelievable why it's been absent since Gen 8. Then there is also online co-op, the first time in the series. Here, you can team up with 3 other friends and explore Paldea. Honestly, I mainly just play Pokemon in single player, but I did have fun playing it with my pal Riley. It could be ideal if you and a friend want to experience a game at the same time, so it might be worth checking out. But even though I won't utilize it often, it's a good addition. Have you noticed the trend? Pokemon Scarlet and Violet will often introduce great concepts, but there's almost always a caveat. You have an open world, but exploration is hindered by awful performance. There is variety with minigames, but they're mindless and boring. And you can see Pokemon in the overworld, but can't catch them in real time. Many think the issue is just performance, and a patch would be the magic to make the game perfect. But this is only covering the surface, because we have yet to cover the presentation. There's a moment at the beginning of the game where Nemona takes you to a lighthouse. and from there, you get a sort of great plateau moment where the game shows you Paldea. I would have laughed, but I was truly at a loss for words. The game often feels the need to tell you how pretty it is, and similar to when a girl you met once tells you how perfect and beautiful she is, that just isn't the case. The performance issues are still the worst factor, but if the game even attempted to look visually appealing, I think some of those performance issues would be at the very least, maybe somewhat justified, maybe because even then, I wouldn't find it excusable, but considering how outdated and bad the game looks, there is no reason why it shouldn't run perfectly. Saying it looks like a GameCube game is not true, because at least with GameCube games, there's a clear art direction. This just looks awful with bad textures and dull environments. Considering it's open world, there's a lot of area to cover, but oftentimes, things like sand and water are flat textures and give the overall presentation a very pre-alpha unprofessional look. But hands down the worst aspect is the amount of pop-in. This relates to performance issues once again. Oftentimes, you'll literally watch the environment load right in front of you. Not only does this visually look awful, but it breaks immersion. You'll often see Pokemon load in when you're close to them, essentially having them pop out of nowhere. Hence the term, pop-in. And even though some scaling is attempted to make the Pokemon size accurate, oftentimes, you won't even see what's in front of you. So what'll happen is you'll be halted by a Pokemon that you didn't even see. They say good graphics don't make a good game, but I'll argue that bad graphics can ruin a game. The only aspect where I can give the game a break graphically is with some of the Pokemon and trainers. They look fine, but not amazing or anything. Some of the terrestrialization stuff looks cool, but you'll often get pixelated shadows that just ruins it. Pokemon is the highest grossing media franchise in the world. Bigger than Star Wars, bigger than Harry Potter, even bigger than Mario. Yet they put out a game that literally looks like shovelware. Actually, never mind, because I've seen shovelware that looks better. Even some of Nintendo's worst games like Nintendo Switch Sports are still visually polished, and what I'll never understand is the amount of excuses I see for this kind of stuff. Take a look at this.
If you're not obsessed with visuals and frame rates, so not expecting perfection, then you'll be happy.
Obviously, this guy knows what he's talking about, because I am clearly obsessed, not considering the fact that I'm constantly looking at digital vomit while I'm playing the game. And to make matters worse, this isn't some kid saying this. This is someone who said they remember growing up with Gen 1 in 99. I wasn't even born until the very end of 99. Good graphics will not make a good game alone, but they can enhance a game greatly. Would Luigi's Mansion 3 be as memorable and as excellent if it didn't have a stellar presentation? And what is the main reason why everyone is praising Wave 3 and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe DLC? Graphics absolutely do matter, and considering the game looks and runs like a grimer on a treadmill, it's a pure detriment to the game. And another excuse I often see is the Switch isn't powerful enough. We've seen time and time again that the Switch is capable of handling beautiful open world games. Xenoblade 3 is a recent example, and even Breath of the Wild, which released 5 years ago, looks infinitely better. The only reason why it couldn't run on the Switch is if it were rushed, and considering the recent Pokemon timeline, that's very likely the case. I'm not sure if it's Game Freak's incompetence with graphical fidelity, but either way, something has to be done. Why not outsource to Bandai Namco, who have proven to make some beautiful looking Pokemon games, like new Pokemon Snap? But it's not just limited to graphics. Corners are cut nearly everywhere, with things like the shops mostly being limited to text menus, and there are also a lack of animations. And in true Pokemon fashion, when there are animations, you get stuff like this. The common defense I see towards moments like the eating animation and the windmill animation is that it's nitpicking, but once you stop defending a billion-dollar company and do some math, those awkward and low-quality animations really start to add up. And combined with the visually appalling graphics, you have a visual presentation that has next to no redeeming aspects, but considering music and sound design are also part of the presentation, the game could fare better there. The music of Scarlet and Violet is good, it gets the job done, but most of it didn't stand out to me. There were some tracks towards the finale I found to be quite memorable, but other than those tracks, I didn't find the music to be anything spectacular. Usually the gym theme stands out, especially in Pokemon X and Y. Even Pokemon Sword and Shield had an incredible gym theme, though to be fair, that's probably where the entire budget for the game went. Like I said, not bad, but passable. It doesn't damage my ears like the graphics do to my eyes, because if I wanted to do that, I'd just listen to modern pop music. But another part of the presentation has to do with sound design, things such as sound effects, and I have to admit, this is an aspect where Scarlet and Violet mostly deliver. I did notice some weird aspects. During the Olive Challenge, I noticed a very familiar sound effect. When I was in elementary school, I played Webkins all the time, and one of the sound effects in Scarlet and Violet seems to be from Go Go Googles. A game from 2005 made in Flash. Highest grossing media franchise, guys! There are also a lot of reused sound effects, but hearing all the Pokemon cries when you pass by them makes the world around you feel somewhat real. Though I will say, is it just me, or do the Pokemon cries from Gen 6 and onward sound lower quality, because I remember them sounding a lot better on the DS, but a Retro Pikachu sound won't be enough for me to deem the presentation as anything but disgraceful. This is not just the ugliest Nintendo Switch game I've played, but the ugliest Nintendo game period. But the thing is, I'm 100% certain this was not a design choice. The awful presentation is likely the result of an overall glaring issue with the game. There's no denying Pokemon has been pumping out games at a Deoxys Speedform's pace. In 1 year alone, we got Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, we got Pokemon Legends Arceus, and now we have Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Ever since the reveal of Gen 9, I've been incredibly skeptical. There is no way they could make an open world game within the span of so many other games. And yes, I'm aware Ilka made the Gen 4 remakes, but even as a fan, it's just exhausting. There's just too much to keep up with. But the question I often see is who is to blame? Is it Game Freak? Or is it Nintendo? Or better yet, is it the Pokemon Company? There's a common misconception that the Pokemon Company is the big boss and Game Freak is being pushed. But the thing is, the Pokemon Company is a branch consisting of 3 companies, Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Inc. What's likely the case is mismanagement at Game Freak. They've been operating on a cycle of a new generation every 3 years ever since Black and White, and it's proven to be unsustainable. I often see the defense,
It's always been like this.
and it's not just limited to Pokemon. I see it all the time for other games.
Mario Strikers games weren't known for having a lot of content, so it's okay for Mario Strikers Battle League to be as paltry as it is.
Just because something has been a certain way does not mean it should stay that way. And just because a prior game had an issue, that doesn't make it okay to repeat. If anything, that's even worse. But in the case of Pokemon, it's a very complicated issue. Pokemon made the jump to consoles, and they might have been able to pull off the 3-year cycle with the handheld games. But it isn't enough time for consoles. I understand that Pokemon is a very lucrative and popular franchise, but even if it has to be this way, here's what I don't get. We know that Pokemon Legends Arceus released back in January, and it was mostly well received, but the game definitely needed a bit more polish. Why couldn't Legends Arceus be the Christmas 2022 title, and then Gen 9 could be the following Christmas season? It would not only benefit the games with more development time, but the fans and developers as well. There needs to be a change, because the only ones benefiting from this are greedy higher-ups. It's also important to bring up the sales. Despite having severe issues, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet managed to sell 10 million, and I repeat, 10 million copies within just 3 days. You may think that there's now no incentive to improve, but I firmly believe that even though there's short-term success, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet will actively damage the reputation of the series. Pokemon Sword and Shield and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were generally seen as little more than lazy cash grabs, but even though Scarlet and Violet clearly have more ambition, that doesn't change the fact the games launched in a buggy and unfinished state. Many will lose trust in the series, and will potentially skip succeeding games. Oh, you play Pokemon? You mean the series that doesn't even have games that work properly? This also applies to something like Nintendo with the Joy-Cons. They have these controllers that they know are defective, but are continuing to sell them. It might be profitable in the short term, but parents will remember the Joy-Con drift. And this is a reason why I think Nintendo's next console could potentially underperform. And speaking of Nintendo, while it is indeed true that they're not directly involved with Pokemon's development, they aren't off the hook either. They could have easily said, The game is clearly not ready. We can't release it until it's in an acceptable state. But look what happened. Whether it's Nintendo or Game Freak or some Pikachu CEO, none of it changes the fact that there is mismanagement and that this situation should have never occurred. The performance issues and presentation are the most glaring, heavily discussed issues. But there is a major oversight that isn't discussed nearly enough that managed to go against everything the game was going for. And all this could have been avoided had there been time to iron out the flaws. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet's sole identity surrounds that it's open world, the freedom to choose the way you want to play. But the fact of the matter is, it's not actually open world! You can technically visit any gym in any order, but you will be absolutely destroyed attempting to bring your lower level Pokemon to a higher level gym. And oftentimes, you'll encounter Pokemon that are much higher level than you are, but you can't even use them until you have enough badges. While you can do some things out of order, there's a general order that you need to follow, and it easily could have been avoided by having level scaling. The Pokemon in the overworld could have been leveled based on the amount of badges you have, and the gyms could scale based on the badges as well. It is such a simple solution to a massive oversight that essentially defeats the entire purpose of the game. This is almost as big of an oversight as not being able to share levels in Super Mario Maker for Nintendo 3DS. I say almost because there is still at least some wiggle room here. But regardless, it just cements what is overall an unfinished, unpolished experience. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are an absolute hot mess in nearly every aspect. Visually, the game looks awful, the new Pokemon are incredibly hit or miss, and the game can't even run properly. And the game couldn't even deliver on the promise of being open world. Simply put, this game is an absolute disaster, and it's seemingly the worst game I've ever covered based on the amount of flaws. So when it comes to the final verdict, you automatically would assume it would be trash. But surprisingly, there's much more to it. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are the very definition of unfinished games. They're buggy and lack any sort of polish, and clearly they were rushed out. I've seen discussion claiming Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are actual unfinished Nintendo games, essentially saying that the things like the Mario sports games or Switch sports aren't unfinished. But just because Scarlet and Violet are unfinished in the more traditional sense, that doesn't mean the sports games suddenly get a pass. Pokemon and the Switch sports games are both unfinished, but in different ways. But which is worse? A game that is functional but has zero content, or a buggy game that has some content and some good mechanics? If you're wondering if I found Scarlet and Violet to be worse than Mario Strikers Battle League and Nintendo Switch Sports, no, not a chance. Because as messy as it is, there's still a game here, whereas with the sports games, there's virtually nothing there. But by no means will that make Pokemon good. I'll always be honest about my thoughts, even if they antiquate my first impressions, and as shocking as it is, I did actually have some fun playing Pokemon Scarlet and Violet.
Ha! Caught you, Pokemon red-handed. Get it? Red? Pokemon Red? Anyways, you just admitted that you had fun with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Glad you saw the light and realized how incredible they are.
Have you literally heard anything else that I've said?
Yes, I heard all of it. I even recorded it with my BlackBerry after playing some Atomic Dove. But you admitted it's fun, meaning it's indeed a phenomenal game.
That's not what I mean.
Objectively speaking, I would rate Pokemon Scarlet and Violet an 8.5 out of 10. Sure, there are performance issues, but they can easily be fixed in a future patch. All games require a patch nowadays. Pokemon is just such a phenomenal game that, in my heart of hearts, it's such a perfect 10 out of 10. And with your entitled bantering, you're not letting us Pokemon fans be happy and ruining our enjoyment. You never like anything that comes out nowadays. So why don't you just save us the trouble and go back to playing your Lord and Savior, the Nintendo GameCube? Smack some freaking bongos, you brat!
First of all, just because a game is fun, that doesn't mean it's good. And the level of fun can vary between games. Are you gonna have more fun throwing a bouncy ball at a door, or going to a theme park? But the key difference here is that Pokemon is being treated like a theme park, up with the giants like Mario and Zelda. I will say it's more fun than throwing a bouncy ball at a door, because that's just a metaphor. But is it worth the major sacrifices? Why should I play Pokemon Scarlet and Violet when games like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and even Mario and Rabbids Sparks of Hope are even more fun to play and manage to have excellent gameplay and presentations, not to mention, they run perfectly at that. And yeah, I will go back to my GameCube games. Maybe I can get a practice round in before I slap, and clap the hell out of you.
Because it's Pokemon! It's a tradition! You don't want to make Masuda angry. After all, if we buy this game, we may get remakes we've been clamoring for, like Pokemon Ultra Sword and Ultra Shield. Don't you want that, Demeech? Don't you want games that I want? Why would you want to play anything else when you can surround yourself with the comfort Pokemon provides?
Maybe I'd agree with you if the games were comforting like a warm blanket, but instead, they're about as comforting as Tingy from Diary of a Wimpy Kid, a thread of a blanket, and visually, the games are just appalling.
You're missing the point. It's Pokemon, not Death Stranding. You're sounding like that freak Jeff Keighley. Since when did graphics matter in these games? Excuses, excuses! Judge a game by the merits it has, not what it doesn't have. What's next? You don't like Smash Ultimate because it has no trophies and beautiful spirits instead? You probably use shower in a can because your attitude reeks. Don't play a PlayStation Wine or Xbox Series bleh.
Dude, there is some Pokemon here, but it's an overall worse experience compared to most of the other Pokemon games. It's better than Pokemon Sword and Shield, but by no means should that be a standard. The game is still not good, and I'm obsessed? What are you now? A Bluebird circus performer? What are you gonna do next? Take a clearly satirical post literally? Defend a billion-dollar corporation? You cuckoo bird?
But it's a step in the right direction, just like how Super Mario Party was. 4 boards is better than none.
Why does a billion-dollar franchise with all the talent and all the resources only have to take steps in the right direction when they can go all the way and reach the destination? Because what we're left with is a game that has some good concepts, but is hindered by not even being finished.
Tell it like it is! That's what Nintendo gets for releasing unfinished games!
Dude, they have been doing this since ARMS. Where have you been?
The sports games aren't unfinished, they're just incomplete. I don't see them being broken buggy messes, but this one definitely is.
I'm not even gonna debate you here. Do you think you could knock some sense into the bird brain?
That's implying he has a brain. Not everyone can be a smarty boy like me. Alright, I wrote a letter to Nintendo about how unsatisfactory the game is. Did you do the same?
Nearly 6,000 words, indented, handwritten in Splatoon ink. I'm ready.
You're looking for the Nintendo cancel? Well, why didn't you say so? Anyway, that seems to be in order.
You are now watching The Meech.
After the release of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, Nintendo has released a boatload of buggy and unpolished games. Sure, games like Mario Sluggers 3 launched in the traditional free updates unfinished way, but we have gotten to the point where Nintendo had the audacity to release some of their biggest games in an unacceptable state. And Super Mario Odyssey 2 is hands down the most disappointing experience that I've ever had. The gameplay is still here, and it has some clever new ideas, but visually, it looks awful. The game can't even run at a stable 30 frames per second, and it's an overall clunky experience, but the worst part about it is that while it claims to be open world, you have to collect the moons in a specific order in order to progress. I honestly cannot believe how it got approved, and I have no idea what happened to the Nintendo that was about quality first before anything else. This explains everything.
Howdy, Demeech.
Smells like burning paper. Would you happen to know anything about that?
Oh, you mean the ungrateful letters. I took care of those.
And now look what happened. I'm so glad people can just be happy with their broken Nintendo games. Awesome, isn't it?
Excuse me.
This cannot go on, and I'm going to find the source and put an end to this once and for all.
Here, have some bombs.
Prepare for Demeech's fury.
Okay.
doesn't even seem to be effective. What is going on here? This bird is literally invincible.
Here, have some bombs.
Demeech, you're entitled and ungrateful, but I didn't want you to faint. I'm sorry, man. Hey, Bird Brain. I enjoyed Pokemon Scarlet and Violet quite a bit, but that doesn't give you the right to go after those who did it. And this is coming from someone who made the mistake of doing so. It's okay to disagree. And criticism just means you care.
Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are absolutely not getting the ranking of treasure, but they're not getting the ranking of complete trash either. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet get the ranking of unmined gems. There is potential for a good game, and I like what the games are going for, but considering how underdeveloped the games are, you're gonna have to do a lot of heavy mining to find the good. It's primarily the open world structure and the story that hold the game together, because if the game was like Sword and Shield and had all the performance issues, I would consider it to be one of the worst games of all time. If you want a more straightforward answer, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet definitely lean more towards the ranking of trash, and even though it has some good aspects, I cannot in good faith recommend it. It did, however, re-spark my interest in Pokemon. Unlike other Pokemon games, I had enough with Scarlet and Violet once I beat it, so what I decided to do is check out a generation I didn't experience much of, and I've been playing Pokemon Emerald. The game may be dated and doesn't have the quality of life improvements like the removal of HMs, but the overall experience is so much more intuitive and rewarding. I hope that Game Freak and Nintendo learned from this fiasco to give Pokemon the time in the oven it needs so it can be the very best like no one ever was.